Bangladesh. You've probably seen the headlines, right?
Yeah.
Protests, political turmoil, a nation on the brink.
Yeah.
But this isn't just another news cycle,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
This is about a country wrestling with some pretty huge questions about its future. So we're going deep today, way beyond those headlines,
Okay.
with firsthand accounts, on-the-ground reports, to try to figure out what really went down in Bangladesh this past summer, why it matters to all of us, and what it says about the fight for democracy everywhere.
Yeah, it's a story that's really grabbed the world's attention, and it all started with something that might seem, well, a little dry at first glance, the job quota system.
Okay, so the job quota system.
Yeah.
I'll admit that doesn't exactly scream international instance.
Right.
So can you paint a picture for us? What was going on there?
Sure. So imagine this. For decades, Bangladesh has had this system in place where 30% of government jobs are set aside specifically for the descendants of freedom fighters from the 1971 war. It's a system that has its roots in the nation's founding, a way to honor those who fought for independence. But
Yeah, that's a pretty big chunk of jobs. And I could definitely see how that could lead to some pretty strong feelings, especially in a country where opportunities can be scarce.
exactly. And that's where things get really interesting, because this wasn't just about numbers. It was about a sense of fairness, about who gets a shot at a good life and who really holds the power in a society. For young people in Bangladesh who were facing a 16% unemployment rate, that quota system, it became a symbol of a system that felt rigged against them.
Yeah. It's one thing to read about unemployment statistics, but to think about what that actually means for people's lives, their hopes, their dreams,
Yeah.
it really puts things into perspective.
Absolutely. And that frustration, that sense of being shut out, that's what fueled the protests that rocked Bangladesh this summer.
Okay, so we've got this powder keg of discontent simmering.
Right.
But what was the spark that actually set things off? What turned that frustration into full-blown protests?
Well, the initial protests in July started on university campuses, led by the students who are most directly impacted by this quota system. They were the ones who first took to the streets.
So they're the ones saying, hey, this isn't right. We deserve a fair shot.
Exactly. They were demanding a level playing field, a chance to compete on their own merit. But then something really interesting happened. Students from private universities, who weren't even subject to the quota, they joined the protests in solidarity. And it became less about the specific policy and more about a shared sense of injustice.
So it sounds like this was a real turning point, a moment where individual grievances transformed into a collective demand for change.
It was. And the government's reaction to those early protests, well, let's just say it didn't exactly help things.
Okay, let's talk about that. We're talking about Sheikh Hasina's government, right? The one that had been in power for over 16 years at that point.
Yeah, that's right. Sheikh Hasina, daughter of Bangladesh's founding father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Her family's legacy is deeply intertwined with the history of the nation, going back to the fight for independence in 1971. But her government, in that moment, they chose to crack down hard on the protests.
So instead of meeting the protesters' demands, instead of opening a dialogue, they doubled down on control.
Essentially, yes. Police were ordered to use force, even live ammunition, against the protesters. People were injured, and tragically, some were killed. It was a brutal response that shocked many, both inside and outside of Bangladesh.
That's incredibly disturbing. And in the midst of all this chaos and violence, one name really emerged as a symbol of this struggle, right? Nayan Miya.
Yes, Nayan Miya's story is heartbreaking. He was a young man who joined the protests, and on August 4th, he was shot by the police. And he was then brutally beaten by members of the Awami League, which is Sheikh Hasina's political party.
So not just shot by police, but targeted by the ruling party.
Yes, and after 48 agonizing days in the hospital fighting for his life, Nayan Miya succumbed to his injuries. And his death, it became a rallying cry for the protesters. His story personalized the brutality of the crackdown. It wasn't just about abstract political debates anymore. It was about real lives lost, about a system that seemed to value power over its own people.
It sounds like Nayan Miya's death was a turning point. It shifted the focus of the protests, making them less about the job quota system and more about justice and accountability.
Absolutely. The protests, they exploded in size and intensity, drawing in people from all walks of life, students, workers, families, all united by this shared sense of outrage and this desire for a different future for Bangladesh. And ultimately, this wave of protests led to a truly historic event, the resignation of Sheikh Hasina after 16 years in power.
Wow, the fall of a political dynasty, that's huge. But her resignation coming on the heels of this brutal crackdown, it must have had a profound impact on her family's legacy, particularly on her father, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, who's considered the father of Bangladesh.
Yeah, it's complicated. I mean, Mujibur Rahman is revered, a hero of the independence movement. But under Hasina's rule, there were these growing concerns about corruption, authoritarianism, the erosion of democratic principles. The protests, in a way, they became a rejection not just of her leadership, but also of the darker aspects of her father's legacy. It was this demand for a return to the ideals of that independence movement: freedom, justice, a government that truly serves its people.
So a nation in turmoil, grappling with its past and its present. But with Hasina out, the question becomes, who steps into the void? Who leads Bangladesh now?
And that's where things get even more interesting. A new government was formed, led by someone who might surprise you, Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, known for his work in microfinance and poverty alleviation.
A Nobel Peace Prize winner leading the country. It sounds like Bangladesh is going through a truly radical transformation.
It is a dramatic turn of events, no doubt about it. And Yunus's government, it brought together this really fragile coalition of different groups, many of whom had been instrumental in those protests. It's a new era for Bangladesh, but it's one filled with both hope and these immense challenges.
And that's where I think we need to dive a little deeper to understand the landscape that Yunus inherits.
Yeah.
It's one thing to change leadership, but what about those underlying issues that fueled this unrest in the first place?
Right.
What about the economic anxieties, the social disparities, the everyday realities that people in Bangladesh are facing? Well, that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive. So we left off talking about Bangladesh entering this new era
Right.
with Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus at the helm.
Yes.
It's a moment of, great possibility, but also one of these, daunting challenges. It makes you wonder, what does change actually look like when a country's been through something this intense?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer it, we really have to go beyond just the political, musical chairs and understand, the reality on the ground for everyday people in Bangladesh. It's easy to get swept up in the drama of, political change, but those problems that sparked the protests in the first place, those are still very much alive and well.
Yeah, so let's talk about those problems. We touched on youth unemployment earlier.
Yeah.
But what are some of the other, deep-rooted issues that Yunus's government is facing?
Well, poverty is a huge one. Despite significant economic progress in recent years, there are still large pockets of poverty in Bangladesh, especially in the rural northern regions. And it's not just about a lack of income, it's about unequal access to basic services. Imagine living in a place where getting quality health care or a decent education is a struggle simply because of where you were born.
It's that feeling of being left behind, like the system's not working for you, that can really breed resentment and instability.
Exactly. And then you layer on top of that the challenge of unemployment, which hits young people particularly hard. We know that even before the protests, the youth unemployment rate was hovering around 16%. Now, think about being a young person in that environment, full of energy and ambition, but with no clear path forward. That's a recipe for frustration, for feeling like your voice doesn't matter, like the future holds no promise for you.
It's almost like this pressure cooker.
Yeah.
All this, pent-up frustration and anxiety with no outlet.
A very apt analogy, yeah.
Yeah.
And then, as if poverty and unemployment weren't enough, there's the rising cost of living. Inflation has been hitting Bangladesh hard, making it even tougher for families to make ends meet. Imagine the daily stress of just, trying to put food on the table, to afford basic necessities, while the prices keep climbing.
It's a feeling a lot of people around the world can relate to these days, that sense of economic anxiety, being squeezed from all sides.
Yeah, it's a global issue, for sure, but in a country like Bangladesh, where so many are already living on the edge, even a small increase in prices can have a devastating impact. And it all adds to that sense of discontent, that feeling that the system just isn't working.
So you've got these, very real economic hardships, but it sounds like there's also this deeper issue here, like a crisis of trust.
That's a crucial point, because running through all of these challenges is the sense that, those in power, the institutions that are supposed to serve the people, well, they've become more interested in self-enrichment than in actually solving problems. Corruption was a major theme of the protests and is something that Yunus's government is very, very acutely aware of.
Yeah, it's one thing to talk about good governance, about transparency, accountability, but how do you actually rebuild trust when it's been so badly broken?
That's the challenge facing Bangladesh right now. It's a monumental task, and it requires, a really multifaceted approach.
Okay, so, break it down for us. What are some of the key strategies that Eunice's government is focusing on to address these issues and rebuild that trust?
Well, first and foremost, they're tackling corruption head on. They've made it clear that there will be zero tolerance for, shady dealings, for using public office for personal gain. They're strengthening anti-corruption agencies. They're pushing for greater transparency in government contracts. And they're making it easier for citizens to report wrongdoing. The message is clear. The old ways of doing business are over.
That's a bold move, especially considering, how entrenched corruption can be.
It is, and it's going to take time and sustained effort to really root it out, but it's a necessary step to show people that this government is serious about change, that's
Hmm.
committed to serving the public good, not just the interests of a select few.
And what about the economic challenges? What's being done to address the poverty, unemployment, the rising cost of living?
Well, Eunice's government has launched this multi-pronged approach. They're investing in education and skills training programs, especially for young people, to kind of equip them with the tools they need to compete in a globalized economy. They're promoting entrepreneurship and small business development to create jobs and stimulate economic growth at the grassroots level. And they're working to attract foreign investment, particularly in key sectors like technology and renewable energy, to create higher paying jobs and boost the overall economy.
So it's about investing in people, empowering them to build a better future for themselves, but also about creating a more dynamic, competitive economy that can lift everyone up.
Exactly. And alongside those efforts, they're also implementing targeted social welfare programs to provide a safety net for the most vulnerable to ensure that everyone has access to basic necessities like food, shelter, and healthcare.
So it sounds like a comprehensive approach addressing the immediate needs, but also those long-term goals of building a more prosperous and equitable society.
It's ambitious, no doubt, but what's particularly interesting is the emphasis on empowering the youth. They're really seen as key drivers of change, and the government is actively seeking their input and participation in shaping policy. It's about recognizing that young people aren't just the future of Bangladesh, they're the present, and they have a vital role to play in, solving these challenges.
We saw just how powerful the student movement was in bringing about political change. So it makes sense to kind of harness that energy and idealism.
Absolutely. And it's not just about giving young people a voice, it's about equipping them with the skills and opportunities they need to thrive. There's a huge focus on improving the quality of education, on providing access to technology and training in areas like digital literacy and coding. It's about preparing them for the jobs of the future, for a world that's increasingly interconnected and, technologically driven.
Yeah, it's this recognition that in the 21st century, education isn't just about memorizing facts. It's about fostering creativity, problem-solving skills, the ability to adapt to a rapidly changing world.
Precisely. And it's about ensuring that all young people, regardless of their background or where they live, have a chance to reach their full potential. That's why there's a particular focus on bridging the gap between, the urban and rural areas, on investing in infrastructure and education in those regions that have been historically neglected.
It sounds like this daunting task, tackling all of these complex issues simultaneously, but is there a sense of optimism in Bangladesh? Do people believe that this new government can deliver on its promises?
Well, there's certainly a mix of emotions. There's relief that Hasina's era is over. There's hope that Yunus can usher in this new era of progress and prosperity. But there's also skepticism, a wait and see attitude.
That's understandable. After all, actions speak louder than words, right? It's going to take time to see if these policies translate into tangible improvements in people's lives.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to, look beyond the headlines, to hear the voices of everyday Bangladeshis, to understand their lived experiences and their perspectives on the future. And that's what we'll do in the next part of our deep dive. We'll hear from students, farmers, business owners, those on the front lines of this fight for a better Bangladesh, to get their take on what's changed, what still needs to change, and what their hopes and fears are for the future.
So we've been exploring this incredible transformation happening in Bangladesh right now. It's a story of political upheaval, economic challenges, that long road to recovery.
Right.
But it's time now to zoom in on the human side of all this, to actually hear from the people whose lives are being shaped by these monumental shifts.
It's really crucial to remember that behind every headline, behind every policy debate, there are real people whose hopes and dreams and anxieties are all tied to the fate of their nation.
Exactly. So let's hear those voices. What are people in Bangladesh saying about this new era? What are their hopes, their fears for the future?
Well, you'll find a real mix of emotions. I mean, there's definitely a sense of relief that the Sheikh Hasina regime is over. That's been replaced by, I think, a sense of cautious optimism about what Eunice's government might actually achieve.
Yeah.
But it's also impossible to ignore this very real awareness of the challenges that still lie ahead.
Yeah, I imagine it's like that feeling after a major storm. You know,
Right.
the immediate danger has passed, but the damage is still visible all around, and that long, slow process of rebuilding is only just beginning.
That's a powerful analogy. And just like after a storm, you see that incredible sense of community, people coming together to support each other, to pick up the pieces, and to start rebuilding their lives.
That's heartening to hear.
Yeah.
But I also can't help but think there must be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety about whether things will truly get better.
Of course, yeah. There's no escaping that. I mean, for many, that daily struggle is very real. Making ends meet, putting food on the table, getting their children a decent education. I mean, these are the things that keep people up at night. Those economic challenges that we discussed they're not abstract concepts. They're the daily realities for millions of
It
Bangladeshis.
makes those political ideals, those grand promises of change, feel
Right.
very distant sometimes when your primary focus is just on getting through the day.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to kind of center the voices of those living these realities.
Yeah.
I recently spoke with a young woman named Amina, a recent university graduate who was very active in the protest. She's brimming with hope, determination, but she's also incredibly clear-eyed about the challenges that are facing her generation.
So what are some of her biggest concerns? What does she see as like the biggest hurdles on the road ahead?
Well, she's worried about finding a decent job one that allows her to actually use her education, contribute to her community. She's worried about the rising cost of living, about being able to afford the basics to build a stable life for herself. And she's also worried about whether Eunice's government will truly deliver on its promises of reform, of change. She's seen those broken promises before.
It's that sense of like, I'll believe it when I see it that comes from,
Yeah.
years of disappointment and unfulfilled hopes.
Right, but here's what struck me about Amina. Even with those very valid concerns, she's not giving up.
Oh, wow.
She's determined to use her voice, her skills, her education to help build the Bangladesh she wants to see. She's just the embodiment of that resilience and that optimism that I think defines so many young Bangladeshis.
She's a powerful example of how, even amidst the uncertainty, people still find ways to hope, to act, to fight for a better future.
Exactly. But it's also important to acknowledge that not everyone shares that same level of optimism.
Yeah.
I spoke with a farmer in the northern region, a man named Rasul, who's been really hit hard by the economic downturn. You know, rising fertilizer prices, unpredictable weather patterns. I mean, these things have really taken a toll on his livelihood. And he's skeptical of politicians. He feels like they've forgotten about the struggles of people like him.
Yeah, his story is a stark reminder that for those struggling just to survive,
Yeah.
those grand political promises can ring hollow.
Yeah.
They need to see, like, concrete action, tangible improvements in their daily lives.
Exactly. And Rasul's experience it underscores a crucial point. The true measure of progress isn't just about changing leaders or implementing policies. It's about creating a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. It's about ensuring that basic needs are met, that people feel this sense of agency, this sense of hope for the future.
It's about making sure those promises of change aren't just empty words, but that they translate into real improvements in the lives of ordinary people like Amina, like Rasul.
That's what will truly determine whether Bangladesh's fight for freedom results in a lasting positive transformation.
Well, expert speaker, this deep dive has been incredibly insightful. For our listener, what would you say is like the single most important takeaway from Bangladesh's journey? What should they remember about this moment in history?
I think it boils down to the power of collective action. The protests in Bangladesh, driven by young people demanding a better future, they showed the world what can happen when ordinary citizens come together, raise their voices. I mean, they toppled this long-standing regime and sparked this wave of change that's still unfolding.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder that change doesn't just happen from the top down. It comes from the ground up, from people demanding more from their leaders, from their institutions, from their society.
Exactly. And it's a lesson that resonates, far beyond the borders of Bangladesh. It's a call to action for all of us to kind of engage with the world around us, to be informed, to be critical, and to never, ever underestimate the power of our selective voice to shape a better future.
That's a powerful message to end on. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive into Bangladesh's fight for freedom, a story that's still being written, and one that we'll all be watching closely.